What up, fam? Welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. So many longtime viewers of the show might remember that a while back, I decided I was gonna make different kind of book covers for each of the different classes in D&D. This is for multiple reasons. One, I really enjoy working with leather, which is primarily what I'm gonna be making this stuff out of. And the other one is, I love me some D&D. So, you know, it's one of those, you've got chocolate in my peanut butter. You've got peanut butter in my chocolate. Although, it's more like you got leather in my roleplay game. That's a little kinky, actually. Anyways, as you may remember, I was going in alphabetical order in the list. So first was the Tome of the Barbarian. This thing was a blast to make, and I love how it came out, where you can see the book in here, and the colors are great, and I love it. So moving on down the list, we're going from Barbarian to Bard. And I may have gone a bit overboard with this one, and I'm so excited to show it to you. So first, I will give you the back of the book. Behold, right? That's pretty. We've got the Bard symbol here. We've got the dragon symbol here. That's awesome, right? You just wait, because on the front of the book, I made a lyre harp. I made the book into a friggin' harp. Not only that, check this out. It plays. Come on, you cannot tell me that isn't amazing. Look at it. So cool. This is the bardest bard book there can be. I'm sorry, I haven't even shown you like how to make it. Usually I save like my crazy geek outs for the end, but seriously, fam, that is dope. Okay, I'm gonna stop nerding out over this thing and show you how to make it. And then at the end, I'm going to use my bardic inspiration to play you an epic song worthy of tale and legend. So let's get right to it and level up this skill. Prepping the leather. All right, so if anybody's new here, the way this show works is we level up skills starting from I didn't know how to do anything to progressively getting better at the whole leatherworking thing or whatever skill we're working on. All that to say, if I use some like techniques or products or whatever that you're unfamiliar with, I want you to check out this playlist up here, and odds are it was covered in previous episodes. Now for this build, I had a really big head start because I'd already made the Tome of the Barbarian, which I can use as a template to bring my Tome of the Bard to life. This especially works out because I want all these books to have kind of a similar look and feel to them, so they're like part of a set, right? Clearly different and representing whatever class they're supposed to represent, but similar enough that they look like they go together. Now for the leather, I'm using this beautiful 6-ounce veg tan that I got from Tandy. Real quick, I bring up Tandy a lot on here. It's where I get most of my leather stuff. Tandy, when you gonna hit me back? What's up? Just saying. Now, not only do I have the actual book itself to kind of go off of and use as a template, but I still have all the templates I made during that episode. Oh, and if you need a refresher or you want to learn how to make these templates, why don't you click on the episode right here. It'll walk you through all the real basic parts of what we're doing right now. Laying my template out onto the leather, I use some of this semi-transparent masking tape just to lock it into position. Then I carefully cut it out with a sharp knife. So I really love the design where it's got kind of the hole in the middle of the book. The way Wizards of the Coast kind of design their books, all of the points of interest are directly in the center. So by making a hole right there, I'm able to see what they kind of wanted you to be looking at right there in the center of the book. Makes it easy for you to kind of pick up the book, know what's in here. And honestly, their artwork just makes everything I'm doing here look that much better because their artwork is amazing. I love their artwork. Speaking of which, for the Tome of the Bard, I decided to use the Dungeon Master's Guide. Mostly because I think purple is a really bard kind of color, and the Dungeon Master Guide is mostly purple. Now to transfer that hole onto my leather, I took a pencil and pushed it through my template right in the center of the circle. Using that mark as a guide, I then set a compass into that mark and used it to make a perfect circle, which I carefully cut out with my razor knife. Again, thanks to having made this already before, I still had the templates for the cross section, as well as the inner flaps that hold the book into place. Now this little leather cross section that holds everything in place, it's really cool looking and really easy to make. Again, if you want to see how it was done, check out that first video. And again, using those templates, I just taped them to the leather and then cut them out with my razor blade. Now at this point, before I go any further in cutting pieces out or whatever, I wanted to make sure everything was fitting. So I went ahead and wrapped it around the book to make sure it was the correct size, and then I liked where the hole in the middle sat. I knew it was good when a Sararak here was peeking out of the middle, like some kind of creeper. As an aside, my group and I finished the Tomb of Horrors fairly recently. I am not a fan of Acererak at all. Jerk. Also take note here that I left the inner flaps and the whole wrapping a little bit long. I just did this because sometimes when you're working with leather, everything looks like it's fit and you cut it all exactly. Then after you're done dyeing it and doing whatever you're gonna do to it, for some reason, things have warped and moved on you a little bit and it doesn't fit perfectly anymore, and it drives me crazy. By leaving it a little bit long till close to the end, you're sure to cut everything to exactly the size you need it to be. All right, and this is a pretty simple build. With that, all of the leather pieces are cut out, which means we can move on to tooling the leather. So before we get into cutting pretty shapes and stamping the leather, we've got to adhere to the basics and make sure that our edges are smooth and sexy. I start that by using this edge beveler just to knock down any sharp corners. Then I moisten the edges and hit them with my slicker. This is gonna lay down the nap on the edge of the leather, give it just a little bit of a shine and make it look really professional. All right, so with our edges looking tight, I wanted to figure out exactly where to put my stamps and my images here. To do that, I needed to lay this wrapping into place to see exactly where it lands. Now there's actually a little bit of a trickiness to this. You don't want to do it while the book cover is laying flat. The reason being, and I don't know if you can see this from the camera, you see the little lump right here where the strap isn't really touching the spine of the book anymore? When the book is closed, it takes up more of this space right here than it does when it's open. So if you lay this strap down flat and you mark that way, when you actually put it together and you close the book, it's not gonna fit anymore. Everything is gonna get too tight. So to keep that from happening here, I just went ahead and put the book inside so that everything had the right shape. Then I put the wrapping in place and made marks so I knew exactly where it would sit. Next, I whacked down my leather so I can start marking out my borders. Using the Tome of the Barbarian as my guide, I realized that my ruler is the exact width of the spine that I'd like. So I just used that as a guide and marked out where the spine would go using a stylus. Next, I used a wing divider just to mark out the rest of the perimeter. With everything looking exactly how I want it to be, I used my swivel knife and made those marks permanent. Then just to add that little bit of depth, I used my bevel stamp just to separate the border from the rest of the book. So a consistent thing I want to have with this series is kind of the symbol that's used for each one of the classes to be featured somewhere on the book. So for the Barbarian, it's this awesome little axe here, and for the Bard, it's this cool little lute here. I also really enjoy having the D&D ampersand dragon. I love that symbol, a really, really cool symbol. So to make sure I have these looking right, I went ahead and printed some out and then put them into position where I'd want them to go. Once they were in place, I just used my stylus to trace the image into the moist leather. Again, it's a really cool feature of leather that once it's moist, you can just kind of mark it however you want and it stays put. It can also be kind of a pain if you're not careful. At the very bottom of the book, I have some dents. I don't know when I did it. I know it was when it was moist. It's probably when I was tooling the rest of these kind of fleur-de-lis in here. It's one of those things that when you notice it happens, you're like, oh, did I do this? But it's really easy to do when the leather's moist, so be careful. So with my symbols all marked out where I want them to be, I went ahead and sharpened my swivel knife to make sure my cuts were nice and clean, and then got to cutting. And I find this bit super relaxing. I throw on an audiobook or some music, and I just take my time and try to make it as perfect as I can. It's one of those like in the zone artistic moments, and I really, really dig this part of the whole process. Oh, and real quick, somebody sent me a message on the Discord, I think it was. They noticed the last time I was cutting the leather was a bit dry. So they gave me the tip to make sure that the leather was still moist while you were cutting, and they were totally right. The cuts were like butter, super, super smooth while the leather was still moist. I guess I just stopped kind of paying attention to that bit of it, and they're absolutely correct. So I don't have your name in front of me, but thank you, whoever you are. And of course, once that's cut, we need to separate it from the background. So again, I busted out my beveler stamp and worked my way all around my cuts. And this is just one of those things that immediately makes your design pop. It has a really cool effect of just kind of separating it from the rest of the piece. It's neat around edges, but even more so around like your design. It's pretty cool. And on a side note, I am super proud of the way this ampersand D&D dragon came out. Like at this point, I've actually made a good amount of them. I know I made 2 for the Barbarian book, one little one down here and one right here. I made one for my DM screen, up here if you're interested in that. But yeah, out of all of them, this one came out the cleanest. I love how that looks. Now to add texture to this book, I had used all these little circle stamps just to give the front a little extra interest so it wasn't all flat. For a bard though, it has to be something a little flashier. So for this, I decided to use this fleur-de-lis design. It's a really pretty stamp. It comes out nice and clear. Again, I got it at Tandy's. Tandy's, what's up? I'm just hawking your wares for free all day long. killing me. Now I had started stamping this on my table and discovered kind of not for the first time that there's just too much bounce in this, and the wood I think is just too soft of a medium to be stamping on. Things generally come out okay, but nowhere near as crisp as what I want for this. I really needed those indents to be solid on this one. So I moved the whole operation down to my concrete floor, and the difference was instant. The stamp was super crisp and clean. There was no bouncing around. Like sometimes you get a little like a double imprint because the stamp will bounce all of a sudden, but none of that. It was perfect every time and it took way less work. Now I've seen on forums, people will go get like samples from granite countertops or whatever and do it on that. I used to have a granite cutting board I do it on, but I broke it way back when I was doing my chest armor and have been too cheap and lazy to go get more. But yeah, I am super happy with the way the stamp came out. I feel like it's really fancy and probably the most barred of the stamps that I have. But all right, so we're gonna actually leave the leather there for now. Some of the rest of the construction is gonna rely on exactly where the Lire bits here sit, and I couldn't really move any further until I had those built. So with that being said, let's move on and start making the Lire. So I'm sure there's gonna be some like hardcore musicians out there or something. They're gonna be like, well, technically that's not a lyre. You see, a lyre's construction is a harp. It doesn't have a neck, so it's not like a lute or a guitar or whatever. I'm doing the best I can. What do you call like a book harp, I guess? All this to say, I had no idea what I was doing with this. Like I had in my head, I wanted the book to be an instrument too because it's a bard and it's what they do. Well, it's one type of bard, but you know what I mean. But I've never built an instrument before, unless you're talking about like a Pringles can drum, which that doesn't count. I should make a drum, like a leather drum head. That'd be cool. So I did what I always do when I have no idea what I'm doing and just kind of looked at what I already had. And I settled on making them out of this 1.5 inch by 1/4 inch poplar board that I had laying around from, aptly enough, making my Dungeon Master screen. It's like it was meant for Dungeon Master something, either the screen or the guide. It's all coming together. But yeah, I thought it was a good choice because it's really thin and I didn't want this to be like crazy proud. Like I don't want the instrument to be way out here and it's just kind of sitting on the book. I want everything to look like it's part of the book, right? And for the little tuning screws here, I just busted out some of these small thumb screws that I had laying in a drawer for like ever. I just never used them and I had them. So I figured the trick was I wanted to get them as close together as possible without them hitting each other. So to make sure that spacing's right, I laid them out on a board and measured the closest distance I could have them together without them getting in each other's way. This turned out to be exactly 5/8 of an inch apart. Using that as my guide, I measured and marked along my board to make sure I can get 8 of these screws to fit, and then added an extra 1/8 of an inch to each side and used that as an overall length. And I figured 8 because it couldn't go too much further than that, and I figured at least having a whole octave worth would make it so you can actually play the thing. And this is the part of the project where me not knowing what I'm doing came to bite me. Because that piece of poplar is so thin, if I just screw the thumb screw into the top of the wood, the thumb screw will stick far enough off the back so that it'll hit the book. And you wouldn't actually be able to turn it to tune anything because the book will be in the way. Not a problem if you're just kind of making this for looks, but I want it to actually play. I need to be able to tune it. And I'm not gonna lie, this had me stuck for a little bit. I really had to think about what I was gonna do next, and this took me a good long time to figure out. I toyed with the idea of using like a thicker board or whatever, but it kind of drove me crazy to think that it was gonna be like that beefy off of the book, plus with this like the extra bars that I was gonna add on it and all that. It would have been crazy. I wouldn't have liked how it looked. But then blessedly, I had an idea. I figured I could use a dowel to put it into place. So the dowel's thick enough to be able to accept those little thumb screws and can be turned slightly off of its axis so that the screws are all kind of facing a little bit forward. So it really isn't taking up too much more space this way than the poplar was taking. It's just using that space at kind of a different angle. Happy with that idea, I used my belt sander to flatten one side of that dowel just so I can have a good flat spot to attach it to the rest of the poplar. Then using that measurement we established earlier, I cut them to length and used some Titebond 3 wood glue to connect it to the top of the poplar, clamping it in place until it dried. Real quick, when you glue up, you want to make sure there is a little bit of overspill because you know you have a positive seal at that point. Just make sure you clean up that overspill with a moist rag or else you're gonna have to fight and chisel it away later. Now I only showed one there, but I made 2 of them the same exact way. It was also about this point that I started to think of where the edge design was gonna look like. While I was messing with it, I noticed that the back of the dowel kind of sit a little bit proud, and I didn't want it to cause the whole thing to bump out and make a space in the back. So to take care of that, I just ran the back along my belt sander to make sure it was perfectly flat. Now for this top piece here, I made my 8 marks 5/8 of an inch apart so that I knew where to place all of my little tuners. Then I carefully drilled them out, angling towards the back. Again, I wanted all these screws to be kind of pitching forward so that they wouldn't bang up against the back here. I also made sure that the holes were just a little bit smaller than they needed to be so that it was really hard to turn them. Mostly because I didn't want the tension of these to start turning them back by themselves. I need them to hold. So speaking of the string, we need a way to connect the string to those thumb screws. This turned out to be super easy. I simply used an 1/8 inch drill bit and drilled a small hole into them. And that turned out to be just one of those simple solutions that just kind of worked out perfectly. I love when stuff like that happens. Because again, I have no idea what I'm doing. Okay, so with that bit figured out, I marked a straight line at the correct size, and then cut my little bridge boards here free. Now again, I wanted this to look a little bit fancy. I didn't want it to just be straight edges. So I did it the laziest way possible. I made this little curve here so that it was pretty much the exact diameter of the top of my belt sander. So I just had to kind of push it into it, and the design was there. But just because it's easy doesn't mean it's bad. I'm standing by it. I think that looks good. And once that was all shaped up, I used some sandpaper just to make the edges a little bit softer. So now that we have the connections here at the top all nailed down, it's time to figure out the bottom. For inspiration on that, I turned to this little ukulele I have, and it doesn't have any strings because I stole some strings for this project here. But yeah, I noticed that all it was this little plate of wood here with holes in it. I figured, that's easy, I can do that. So I started by marking the max height of where I wanted the holes for those strings to begin. The thought here was to drill from the bottom at an angle so that the holes kind of come out in the face here. But I wanted them all to line up and look good, and making those marks just gave me something to shoot for. So with that in mind, I just carefully angled my drill and went for those holes. I'm not gonna lie, it came out really well. And after it's sanded, they straight up looked like they were meant to be there. Like, I'm really happy with how those come out. Like, these are all lined up in a row, and the little line of like the way it comes out are all straight. I was super happy with it. I know out of all this, it's like a weird thing to be most proud of, but if you've ever tried drilling wood, you know that it can sometimes take the bit for a walk and whatever, and I don't gotta explain myself to you. It came out good and I'm happy with it. So with those all set up, we need one more thing to make this whole thing work, and that's these bridges here. Without them, the strings would buzz against the rest of the poplar here, and the tension just wouldn't maintain as well. And again, in an effort to keep this super simple, I just split a dowel down the middle. Then I temporarily put a guitar string in place, just to see where best to place the bridge. Then I glued it and clamped it into place. Now notice I kept these long. Just like I said with the leather, sometimes it's nicer to leave things long and then sand them or cut them to exactly what you need to at the end so that it comes out perfectly. And with just a quick visit to my belt sander, the angles and the little slope here matches the back piece perfectly. Cool, so with these built, we can set them in place on the leather and mark on the wrappings where these are gonna sit. Then I trim those 2 arms to size so that they don't get in the way. I also took this moment to run a stitch groove all around the edges as well. And a quick note on this, as you're gonna see later, I actually didn't end up stitching all around here. Instead, I just ended up using a barge cement. I think I'm going to end up stitching it. The barge cement, it holds well. The leather will break before the barge lets go. But I love having that reinforcement, and I like the look of the stitching. Like, I did it for the barbarian one, and I love how that looks. It's really cool looking. It really just came down to time. It took me so long to kind of figure this bit out, and I wanted to make sure I had a video up for you guys. And stitching takes a lot of time to do. If you really want to see me stitch it, you can watch this video. It's the exact same process. Cool, so at this point, all the pieces are ready to go. But before we put them together, let's make them pretty and move on to dyeing. This should really be dyeing and painting, because there's a lot of painting happening here as well. So I decided to start the dyeing process with the wrapping and also with the flaps for the inside. This is just because they're gonna be solid colors, which means I can dip dye them. Now for that, I'm just pouring this USMC black into a container large enough to fit these pieces. Then I simply dip them inside for a nice even coat. If there was a way I could dip dye just every piece, I would. It always comes out like really clean, really even. Yeah, I find adding the color gratifying, but it's not my favorite part. I feel like it's the part that I can definitely mess up the most, and it scares me. But alas, I cannot dip dye everything, so to move on to the edges here, I busted out a paintbrush and went at it the old-fashioned way. Just going really slowly and being super careful not to get any of this black into where I want the rest of the colors to live. This is definitely another one of those parts though where you want to put on like some music or an audiobook and really just take your time. The slower you go and the more meticulous you are with it, the better the result is going to be. And once the edge was done, I did the spine the same exact way. Luckily, it being a little thicker, it was easier to brush on the whole middle section and then just cut in the edges. And again, it might feel painfully slow, but it's really worth it to take your time here. Now again, for the body of this book, I decided to go with this really nice deep purple. It goes with the Dungeon Master Guide, and it's a very barred color to me. It's kind of decadent, but because I'm going to be using a rag, and by doing that, it's hard to avoid getting it onto the features that I don't want it on, I just decided to trace around everything in purple with a thin paintbrush. This way, I can isolate all my carvings and make sure I don't get the purple anywhere I don't want it. It's also going to give me a little bit of a buffer around all of my carvings so that when I'm putting it on with a rag, I can only go to that bit and not have to get any closer than I need to. Because you know I'm just going to accidentally brush something and go crazy. Now aside from the purple being kind of a bardy color, I decided I wanted to use like a gold and a silver paint just to add a little bit of aristocratic flair to it. Plus, I really wanted an excuse to use these two paints that I picked up. They're made by EcoFlow specifically for leather. They have a really nice glittery kind of metallic finish to them. They really stand out and pop. I bought them on a whim one day. I've had them for like a year and a half and I've just never used them. So I figured, why the hell not? The bar's the perfect time to use something like that. So starting with the loot, I colored the body gold, and then I made the fingerboard and also the little tuners silver. The dragon here, I went with the opposite, making the main body silver, and then giving him some solid gold flames. And can I just say again, I am super happy with the way this dragon turned out. Even more so when it's painted, it's so good. Now with those all painted and me liking how they came out, I wanted to be doubly careful that I didn't get any of this purple on it. So I went ahead and thickened my border of purple just to keep the rest of the dyeing process further away from all those assets. Then, using a rag, I went ahead and filled in the rest of the spaces with this purple, just trying to keep it as even as possible. Now, maybe some of you out there know better than I do and can fill me in on this. I noticed on a test piece that I did that if I had put like too much on, it would almost stay like really dark and have like a greenish tinge over the top. Almost like an oil slick, like a shiny green tint. You can kind of see it a little here where I had added more than in other spaces. It was honestly making me really nervous. Like I was really careful to try to add it on almost dry, so it was going on as light as I could possibly make it. But the fact that it still showed up, like I thought I ruined the project. Then I read online somewhere that somebody else was having the same problem with a different color and that they used leather balm and that actually smoothed it out. And thankfully, they were right. The leather balm totally got rid of that greenish tinge and also just kind of mellowed out and evened up the rest of my dye job, as well as adding a really pretty shine to the whole project. And seriously, like seeing that, even if I didn't have that greenish tinge, I just want to add a leather balm to every project. It really made the dye super even and it made it pretty. Like it almost feels like the lighter tones stand out a little bit more and kind of marbled the whole piece a little bit. I really like how that looks. So yeah, hot tip, before you freak out with your dye job, try adding a little bit of leather balm to it. It might fix something, I don't know. Worked for me, how's that? All right, but if you're watching, you're gonna be like, hey, the little stamps you made are completely empty of dye. That looks terrible. Worry not though, I've had a plan for this the whole time. I really wanted them to stand out and match kind of everything else I had going on here. So the thought is to have some of my shiny metal paint settle within all of the indentations here. Now to make sure the paint didn't discolor my leather, I first used my airbrush to add some resist to the top of everything, just to lock all of the colors into place. By using a resist, it seals up the project, protecting it and making sure it doesn't take in any more pigment that you didn't want. And by using an airbrush instead of brushing it on, I made sure that none of my purple pigment got in my dragon or my loot. Again, to some of you more experienced out there, I've had the issue before where I go to brush the roslyn on and some of the pigment seems to come up in it and drag over my other parts. It's usually not enough to care about, but I just didn't want it to show up on my little shiny bits here. Now to get this metallic effect here, I put the paint in a small cup and added just a little bit of water to thin it out. Then I used a brush to paint it onto the cover, making sure that it got into all the little crevices of my stamps. Once it was in place, I immediately wiped it away with a moist rag. The resist coating helped make sure that the pigments didn't discolor the book at all, and made it really easy to just wipe the paint back off. The only places I couldn't wipe off were deep in those little crevices, exactly where I wanted the paint to be. This left me with a really pretty gold and silver inlay in each one of my marks. And this is another one of those little pat myself in the back moments. I wasn't sure that was gonna work, and I was so worried it was gonna ruin my book, but it came out really good. Like, it's metallic and shiny. I don't know if it's easy to tell on camera, but it looks really, really good. Now, while we're coloring things, I wanted to go ahead and paint these gold as well. Now, at one point, I was making my little Witcher medallion and I made it silver, and one of you said in the comment section that before I paint anything like a metallic tone, I should actually paint it black underneath. They explained to me that it adds more depth to the paint job in general, and since then, I've actually seen Adam Savage do that on one of his shows, so long story short, I took that to heart and I decided to spray paint them a flat black first. Then once they were dry, I brushed on my gold metallic paint until I had this nice, shiny, even finish. Is it kind of gaudy? Is it kind of loud? Yes, because it's for a bard. And now that it's looking damn sexy, we can move on to putting it all together. So we have the lyre bits and we have the leather bits. It's time they came together to make the Tome of the Bard. Now, first things first, as I had mentioned before, having the book in place and the whole thing closed is gonna help us place everything where it needs to go. To help us facilitate that, we're gonna wanna go ahead and put these little keeper flaps in first. To do this, I laid the book in place and drew a light line around its edges. That leftover space between where the edge of the book ends and where the edge of the leather ends is where we're gonna wanna add our glue. Now, as I mentioned before, for this project, I'm using barge cement. This stuff just sticks everything to everything else. Once you've given it a little bit of time to cure, it makes a secure and permanent bond. So using a paintbrush to make sure I have even coverage, I put it on both the book cover and the flaps in corresponding spaces. Then after letting it cure for 15 to 20 minutes, I carefully stick them into position, bonding them together. Now be really careful with this step because as soon as the two halves of glue touch each other, that's where it lives. It stays there forever now. You kind of have a better chance ripping the surface of your leather off than you do ripping the glue apart. And of course, I do it to both sides, making sure that everything is exactly into position and firmly set into place. And behold, we have a book cover. That's right, at this point, if that is all you did, you have a book cover. But you don't have an epic bard book cover. For that, we're gonna continue on and do the same with the wrapping here, setting it into place and then marking around it with a pencil. This is just so you know the space to apply the cement to. Then, after applying the barge to both sides and waiting 15 to 20 minutes, I just go ahead and lock it into place. Quick note here though, I didn't glue the spine. As mentioned before, we need that to be able to move because it's in a different shape here than it is here, and you need to be able to give it that freedom or else it's gonna bend the leather here really funny. Or it'll like fight you, it won't wanna open, it'll try to spring itself closed again. So yeah, just make sure you stop your glue before the spine. Also, because the front is the most important feature, I did that first. And then once that was in place, I knew the back was just gonna fall where I needed it to. Ooh, also while gluing it, it didn't film right, but I have a little keeper here that the leather strip sits in to make sure the book stays closed. It's just a tiny little ring of leather that I stuck underneath this and glued it into place. It's really nothing crazy or fancy, but you know, it works. All right, so now that the leather's all done, it's time for the lyre. Now, because the strings are gonna keep this whole thing under tension, I can't just connect it to the leather because it's gonna pull and warp the whole thing and it won't ever stay in tune. So to get around that, I decided to use this metal stock to give it some rigidity and brace the whole back of the thing. Now, to make sure it didn't dig into the book at all, I went ahead and rounded the edges, ensuring there's nothing sharp. I don't care how cool this cover is, I can't have it damaging my precious, precious book. Next, I put the pieces of my instrument into position and used them to mark out where I needed the drill holes in my metal to sit. I just wanted to make sure the screws didn't interfere either with the strings or wherever these little thumb screws come in. I also needed to make sure the little pieces of metal were far enough apart so you couldn't see them through this little window here. With those all marked out, I just brought it over to my drill press and dropped those holes into place. Then I went ahead and added a countersink to them to make sure any screws I add to it lay down nice and flat. And overall, these things came out pretty clean looking. To make them look even better and match the overall aesthetic, I went ahead and painted them black to match the interior of my cover. This is another easy thing that I was very happy with how it came out. Anyways, from here, I went ahead and made sure that the lyre was exactly where I needed it to be. Then I traced around it with a pencil. Now I can use those marks as a guide and lay my brackets on top, knowing that they're going to be within the footprint of my lyre. This way I can easily mark my holes and make sure they land right where I need them to. Next, I went ahead and punched out holes using those marks as my guide. This way I have a clear runway for screws to come up through the back into the lyre without worrying about it getting all caught up in the leather. Now, since I do want the lyre parts to be part of the book cover, I went ahead and applied barge to both pieces and then combined them together. I just figured it would help stop them from moving around over time, and it would add the rigidity of the leather to the overall structure of the lyre. With that all placed together, I marked a drill bit with some tape to make sure that I didn't go too deeply into the wood, and then pre-drilled all of my holes. Then I just went ahead and screwed my brackets into place. By doing that, I was pretty sure I was able to add enough rigidity so that the strings wouldn't pull the whole thing together. Speaking of strings, it was time to string this sucker up and see if it worked. To do this, I went ahead and bought some of these ukulele strings from a music shop just up the street from me. At first, I thought I was only gonna do like a 4-string thing because I didn't know how much would fit on here. I quickly realized though that that wouldn't be enough to do much of anything with the setup I had, so I stole some strings from my ukulele to finish this whole thing off. And I figured using these kind of strings would be better because they're made out of like a plastic rather than a metal that a guitar string would be made out of. I just figured the metal strings would require more tension, and you know, this is a book. I didn't know how much tension I'd be able to put on the whole system. Now to attach them, I just fed the string through the bottom and tied them in place just as you would with any old ukulele. And if you don't know how to tie that on, I'll leave a little link in the description below on where I learned how to do it. It's super easy. You just kind of form a loop and then you twist it around twice and pull. That was a horrible way to explain it. Just watch the video, super clear. I then went ahead and fed the other ends through the holes I made in my thumb screws and twisted them down to add tension to the string. Now, because of how small I made the holes, they're actually quite hard to move, so I end up using pliers to do this. I'm actually okay with that though, because poplar is a pretty soft wood, and I was afraid that if I had it like exactly the right size, it would loosen up too much and it wouldn't hold the weight of the string at all. And once it was all in place, already I am jazzed with it. It's not even really able to make sound yet, and I am beside myself with how this looks. We even have a Serarak behind bars here where he belongs, which I love. But even though I love just the way it looks, I needed to see if it would play. Slash, I was a little bit afraid that I'd tighten it and it would just kind of rip the whole thing apart. So I just went ahead and busted out a tuning app on my phone and slowly began to try to tune it to the G major scale. And once I got it fairly close, it was pretty easy to pick up the difference by ear. It's actually really impressive how most people with like limited musical training can definitely pick up when something's out of tune. It just feels wrong. But yeah, I just went ahead and kept tweaking it until finally... That's right, I made my Dungeon Master Guide play music. It sounds actually really good. I would think like without having the resonance chamber like a guitar has here to help it be louder, it actually is able to carry pretty well. That's a little book harp. That's really cool. I'm sorry. Like before I started filming, I'm just sitting here like, now we know it plays. I must take my place as the epic bard. Prepare for my rendition of Toss a Coin to Your Witcher. So, hold on. No. Toss a coin. No, that's not right. Oh, Valley of Plenty. No, come on. I either underestimated how hard music was or overestimated my abilities. Fine. Will be slightly less epic, I guess. I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle, here is my spout. I'm more of a vicious mockery kind of bard anyways. Despite my terrible vocal stylings of the Epic of the Teapot, if you liked what you saw, why don't you hit me with some of that thumbs up love, and do not forget to subscribe so you know when I release new content. Don't worry, there will be far less singing in the next episode. You know what? I can't promise that. I do this thing week to week. I don't know what I'm doing next episode at all. Let me also send a big thank you to Heather and Ryan Do Stuff. They're my latest high-tier Patreon. They helped pay for all of this here today. I really appreciate your support. I'm sorry I used it for vocal atrocities at you. But honestly, the fact that you like this show enough to support it just means everything to me. I really do appreciate it. If any of you would like to support what I do here as well, the link to the Patreon is in the description below. Also, if there are any skills you'd like to see me try to do, why don't you leave it down in the comment section and I will add it to the list. Oh, one last thing. Also down in the description, Skilltree now has merchandise. We have it on Redbubble, which lets you print on pretty much anything, so you can get stickers, t-shirts, toilet seat covers. I don't know what you want to do with my show's logo. But yeah, definitely give it a look and tell me what you think, or if you want me to add stuff to it or whatever. All right, well, I better get going. The work of an epic bard is never done. I have friends to buff and enemies to mock. In the meantime, keep leveling up, you.